This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Throughout 2023, wars have dominated the Western news cycle, from the Russia-Ukraine war to Israel's invasion of Gaza, on top of dozens of other conflicts around the world. In fact, there are more conflicts happening right now than we've seen in a very long time. According to the latest Armed Conflicts report from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, there were an astonishing 183 regional conflicts around the globe in 2023, the highest figure in 3 decades. So in this video, we're going to have a look at conflicts happening right now, the factors that might explain why we're seeing so many, and finally, the humanitarian impact as we enter 2024. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Firstly, for a bit more background on all the wars going on right now, you should check out our recent video, Every War in 2023 So Far, which covers the main conflicts by continent. But turning to the topic of today's video, why are there so many conflicts happening at the moment? Well, there are a few overlapping factors that we're going to look into here. Number 1, territorial disputes. Number 2, the rise of authoritarianism. Number 3, the rise of organised crime. Number 4, the role of armed non-state groups. And number 5, climate change. If you've got any other ideas, then please do share them in the comments below. So let's take the first factor, territorial disputes. Territorial disputes are generally viewed as the most common source of regional conflict. In 2023, we've seen examples of this in Palestine and Ukraine, as well as in Kashmir, the South China Sea, and the Essequibo region between Venezuela and Guyana. Lingering territorial disputes from the collapse of the Soviet Union also led to Azerbaijan's invasion of Nagorno-Karabakh, an ethnically Armenian region, in September, with border tensions also persisting between Russia and Georgia. Territorial disputes are also incredibly difficult to resolve, and they're the type of conflict most likely to escalate into full-blown interstate wars. In a sense, the war in Ukraine escalated from a regional dispute in 2014 to a full-blown interstate war last year, and the ongoing conflict in Palestine is already starting to spill out into the wider Middle East, sparking tensions on Israel's border with Lebanon and in northern Yemen, where Houthi forces have launched missile and drone attacks on shipping off the coast. Obviously, territorial disputes have been a feature of global politics forever, but they've become more frequent recently for 2 reasons. First, international peacekeeping missions aren't what they once were. The UN is already overextended and looking at a funding shortfall in 2024, and the US/NATO are less interested in playing global policeman after its misadventures in the Middle East. Second, the global norm that states don't use military power to enforce their territorial claims has been weakened by events like Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Essentially, states were less likely to go to war for their disputed territories in the past, because, well, it was very rare. So aggressor states knew that, if they tried to use military power to enforce their territorial claims, they'd be subject to widespread international criticism and risk international isolation. However, with big countries like Russia involved in territorial disputes, potential aggressors feel more confident because they know that their adventures won't garner as much international attention and that there'll always be a club of similar-minded countries to protect them from diplomatic isolation. Territorial disputes often link in with our second factor, which is the rise of authoritarianism. The world is in a so-called prolonged democratic recession, and every year for almost 2 decades, more countries have moved towards authoritarianism than towards democracy. To give you a sense of the pace of this, if the decline of democracy continues at the present rate, less than 5% of the world's population will live in a full democracy by 2026, according to analysis by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. Autocracies are, unsurprisingly, more likely to trigger conflict, as we've seen in Russia's aggression towards its neighbours, as well as China's threats towards Taiwan. Authoritarian states currently involved in conflict include Afghanistan, Syria and Iran, whilst authoritarian governments in Latin America, such as Venezuela and Nicaragua, have also recently threatened their neighbours over territorial issues. As well as threatening other countries more, autocracies are also more prone to civil war. Just look at the devastation in Haiti, Yemen and Myanmar this year. Moving on to our third factor now, the rise in organised crime, specifically illegal arms and drugs trafficking. The 2023 Global Organised Crime Index found that 83% of the world's population live in countries with high crime, compared to 79% in 2021. Criminal groups often take advantage of the political instability and commodity shortages caused by conflict, with many of the most crime-affected countries in 2022 being the war-torn countries Afghanistan, Iraq, Myanmar, Ethiopia and Ukraine. But it also works both ways, as criminal rivalries worsen regional conflicts. Take Latin America, for example, where disputes over drug trafficking routes and networks caused a surge in violence in Ecuador back in July, and fighting over the local drugs market in Costa Rica led to record levels of homicides. Last week, the UN Security Council held a long debate about the serious growing threats posed by transnational organised crime, acknowledging that transnational criminal networks fuel conflict and contribute to the spread of terrorism. Now, this leads on to our fourth reason for the rise in regional conflicts, which is the influence of armed non-state groups. Armed groups, including militias, are increasingly driven conflicts in the Middle East, North Africa and the Sahel. Sub-Saharan Africa has seen a 48% increase in fatalities due to armed militia conflicts this year, and is now the region with the greatest annual number of militant attacks globally. While Islamic militants are widespread across Africa in areas with Muslim populations, organised violent groups are concentrated in specific areas like the Sahel, Lake Chad Basin, Somalia, northern Mozambique, and the North Kivu province in the DRC. Fighting between different armed groups, often over territory or ethnic tension, both prolongs existing conflict and triggers new ones. Armed militias are also multiplying. The number of armed non-state groups in countries on the IRC's emergency watch list this year is higher than literally ever before, and the number of conflicts involving these groups has doubled since 2010. These conflicts are particularly difficult to resolve because negotiating with these groups is difficult. Fighting in Sudan, which tops the IRC's watch list, began in April between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces. But the additional involvement of the armed militias escalated the conflict and scuppered any hope of negotiations between the two sides. One final factor, which is especially prevalent in both sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, is the worsening climate crisis. 3 decades ago, 44% of conflicts happened in climate-vulnerable states, but now that figure is 67%. A recent report from the Institute for Economic and Peace found a link between the effects of climate change and the risk of conflict. Food insecurity increased risk by 36%, natural hazard exposure increased risk by 21%, and lack of access to clean water increased risk by 18%. 3 new hotspot countries, Niger, Myanmar and Ethiopia, have particularly suffered this year too. Niger is fighting jihadists in the Sahel, while 12% of its population faces food insecurity. Ethiopia is battling a new revolt in its Amhara region, where millions are affected by drought. And Myanmar, which is in the grip of a civil war, was devastated by a cyclone in May that worsened the needs of 1.1 million people already in need of aid. So, going into 2024, what can we expect? Well, there will be a severe humanitarian impact right across the globe, as more conflicts threaten millions more lives. This is already affecting the UN's ability to deliver aid. Last week, the UN announced it was scaling back its 2024 humanitarian appeal amid a severe and ominous funding crisis. In 2024, around 300 million people will require aid, but the UN has cut its target from helping 245 million people to just 181 million. Having received just over a third of the $57 billion it aimed to raise last year, the body has cut its 2024 appeal to $46 billion, despite the worsening humanitarian situation. The UN's aid chief, Martin Griffiths, has called it the worst funding shortfall in years, and has asked donors to dig deep for more support. All in all, things are looking rather bleak. More conflicts, more autocracies, the accelerating climate crisis, and a humanitarian aid shortfall are taking a serious toll on people across the world. 1 in 5 children lived in or fled from a conflict zone this year, and 1 person in every 73 is displaced. The number of victims killed in conflict has also increased by 14% compared to last year. In Afghanistan, 10 million people lost access to food assistance between May and November, while in Yemen, more than 80% of people targeted for aid still do not have proper water and sanitation. Ultimately, this needs and resources gap is not going to narrow as long as conflicts continue to worsen due to various overlapping factors in the coming years, which is terrible news for global stability. As we step into 2024, many of us are contemplating our New Year's resolutions, always looking to improve ourselves and learn more about the world around us. And while our content is always a good starting point, a lot of stuff we talk about can seem pretty complicated, especially when we dive into analytics and detailed data. But luckily there's a fun and easy way to learn more, which also doesn't cost thousands of dollars or take years and years of schooling. That's because Brilliant is the best way to learn maths, data science and computer science interactively. And the good thing is, it doesn't take long to learn either. These complex topics are broken down into small but accessible chunks, designed around your busy schedule. Even just a few minutes a day can help you with accumulating new knowledge over time in a fun and engaging way. As time goes on, you'll also get used to that empowering feeling of learning too, because Brilliant isn't just about memorization and lectures. Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise quite complex subjects, and ensuring you actually understand what's going on. So whether you want to brush up on your basic maths skills, improve your employment prospects, or just have another New Year's resolution for 2024, you can check out everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days by going to brilliant.org/TLDR. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support.